Hello and welcome to this mini webinar on population projections. I'm Hannah Kiewer and I'm currently working in the team producing population projections at Eurostat. Before showing you some of the results of this year's population projections round, I would like to just say a couple of words on what we're trying to do with projections. Basically, we and policymakers are interested in the population in the future, up to the year 2100. Obviously, a lot can change from now to 2100, and we cannot make an accurate forecast of the population at that point in time. Instead, we are trying to answer the question, what will happen to the EU population if current trends in fertility, mortality, and migration, which drive the development of population, continue? Now, how does that work? So we look at today's population and then we consider the births, the deaths, and the migration that is happening over the year. We add up these factors to arrive at the new population at the end of the year. Now, if births exceed deaths, the population will grow. If immigrants exceed emigrants, the population will grow. And of course, vice versa. If we have more deaths than births, and more immigrants than immigrants, we will see a decline in population. In order to derive projected population over the next 75 years, we have to derive assumptions to learn about future births. So we make assumptions over fertility, for mortality, as well as over migration. If you want to learn more about the methodology underlying these assumptions, you can look at this link for the assumptions for each individual country. Once we put it all together, we arrive at the final projected population. In this round, we project that population in the EU will continue to increase for another 3 years, very slightly only. And from then on, we will enter a period of declining population. And that by the end of this century, we end at a number that is just slightly below 400 million. We project that the median age of the EU population is expected to increase by almost 7 years during that time period. And we expect that the proportion of elderly people above the age of 65 is going to double by that time. Another way of looking at this data is this bar graph of the total population broken down by major age groups. You can see the observed data until 2024 and then the projected data from 2025 on. And very notable is that all age groups decline in terms of size, with the exception of the age group 80 years and over, which is in this graph, this buttery yellow group. Another way of looking at the same process is by using population pyramids. It's still called a pyramid, even though we no longer have the highest cohorts at the bottom. Right now, you can see the projected population by age and sex for each year of the projection horizon. And you see that the big bulk of the population is aging and actually increasing the population at the top of the pyramid, while the new cohorts are smaller than the initial ones we started with in 2025. Now, in the beginning, I was talking about assumptions we make on fertility, on mortality, and migration, and which are underlying the projected population. And I also was talking about the problem that we cannot make accurate forecasts. Of course, we also don't know exactly what will happen to mortality, fertility, or migration. This is why we also create some sensitivity tests or scenarios where we change some assumptions and keep others stable. In this graph, you can see that the sensitivity test for higher migration, in this case, 33% higher immigration into the EU, and lower migration, the 33% lower immigration into the EU, give very different results from the projected baseline population. And in one case, we even have a slightly increase in population, while in the other, we can see a much bigger decline than in our baseline population. So these sensitivity tests are really useful to show the range of possible outcomes we might have. So far, we've looked at results for the EU as a whole, but of course, this is an aggregate of all the individual country results, which is shown in this graph. Just to give a quick impression of the range of projected outcomes, on the left-hand side, we see that we have countries that are still projected to grow and grow substantially over the next 75 years, while on the right-hand side, you see a group of countries for which we project sizable declines. In the link, which you can see on the slide, you can find individual country results for all countries, this graph, but also many other ones, if you're interested to explore the results for your country further, for example. Now we come to some of your questions. I will rephrase this question a bit to make it a more statistical question and say, how will demographic change impact the size of the working age population? We've already seen in previous slides that we project a decline of all age groups except for the very old group of 80 and above. No matter actually which definition of working age we use, we have three different ones on this slide. We see that all three are projected to decline in the baseline projections. Now, also earlier, we were looking at different sensitivity tests or different scenarios to show the range of what is possibly going to happen to the population. We're using these same scenarios plus an added one, which has no migration at all, to show what could possibly happen to the projected population of working age. And here, the definition I chose is the group 15 to 74, as it's the biggest one and has the oldest worker in there as well. So we see that basically all scenarios, all definitions project that there is going to be a decline of the population of working age. Now, what exactly this means for labor markets depends on too many other factors to dive into here. Just another word instead on the sensitivity test on no migration. This is, of course, not a realistic scenario. It's mainly there to show what would happen if there was no other impact than birth and death on the population. It's mainly illustrative to highlight the impact of migration on projected population. Now we've just seen what will happen to the working age population, that no matter what our assumptions are and no matter what age group we select, we expect that group to shrink until 2100. And we can combine this information with the age group of 65 years and above. We can calculate the ratio to express the old age dependency ratio, and it actually shows how many persons of working age are currently in the population for each person aged 65 and older. And we go from about 33% to roughly 60 or 66, depending on the exact definition of the ratio chosen. No matter which age group we choose here for this indicator, we see that in both cases, we expect an increase until 2100, roughly double of the ratio we currently see. Now, this looks really bleak, but we can go into a little more detail on this question. Specifically, we can dive a bit deeper into the question of what if we consider that not everyone is actually working? So we are looking at the populations, and now we are going a tiny bit outside of pure demography, and we look at the activity-based dependency ratio. So there we also consider that persons of working age may be outside the labor force. And we adapt the ratio seen earlier to say we calculate the share of those outside the labor force and those of pension age to the total labor force. And plugging in some numbers we have published from the EU LFS, we can calculate that with the current actual retirement age in the EU and the current labor force participation rate, we would have an activity-based dependency ratio of roughly 100%, which means that for every person in the labor force, there is one outside the labor force for the whole population aged 20 and older. So that's already a really different picture from what we've seen. And then, and this is important, just an exercise. So these are not published numbers. This is purely an experiment, a thought experiment to see what could happen if we assume that in the future, all persons who are currently 16-year-old will work until they're 70, so roughly until 2080. And if we assume that the entry into the labor force will remain at 20, we can take the projected number of persons aged 70 and older, the projected number of persons aged 20 and 69, those we have from the projections, and we can combine that with the assumption that the labor force participation rate could increase to 82. This is an actual observed rate in one of the EU countries at the moment, and it's not the highest, so it seems like a relatively safe assumption that this is something that could possibly happen. And if we put all this together, we would arrive at an activity-based dependency ratio that's actually lower than the previous one. And this exercise is, again, it's not a published number at all. It's just an illustration to show you that policy that tackles the actual pension age and or retirement age and the labor force participation rate can have a very large impact on the actual number of people that depend on the labor force. This is a really interesting question, and it's also one that's tough to answer because, of course, we're looking at 75 years into the future. What I can say is that in our current projections, what we have is an assumption where we do not continue the current trend of falling total fertility rate, but instead we assume that there is a slight recuperation of fertility and then a stabilization at a somewhat higher level than we currently observe. Still at a low level for fertility, but higher than now. However, we also have the low fertility scenario where we formulate assumptions that are 20% lower um, than the baseline assumption, exactly because we do observe these trends towards really low fertility at the moment, and we cover this probability or this outcome as well. Now, however, the baseline was formulated due to the available information we have, and we do see in some countries that this strong drop has actually slowed down, and in some countries even stabilized fully already. So in combination with the literature, where a lot of papers say that we should expect some recuperation of delayed fertility, we believe that the baseline scenario is a reasonable assumption for the EU. Of course, we may have individual countries that become very similar to South Korea or Japan, but we're talking here about the EU as a whole, and there we see rather a stabilization at a low level and not a complete collapse at the moment.